A transcontinental railroad is a contiguous network of railroad trackage that crosses a continental landmass with terminals at different oceans or continental borders. Such networks can be via the tracks of either a single railroad, or over those owned or controlled by multiple railway companies along a continuous route. Although Europe is crisscrossed by railways, the railroads within Europe are usually not considered transcontinental, with the possible exception of the historic Orient Express. Transcontinental railroads helped open up unpopulated interior regions of continents to exploration and settlement that would not otherwise have been feasible. In many cases they also formed the backbones of cross-country passenger and freight transportation networks. In the United States of America, a series of transcontinental railroads built over the last third of the 19th century created a nationwide transportation network that united the country by rail. The first of these, the 3,103-kilometer Pacific Railroad, was built by the Central Pacific Railroad and Union Pacific Railroad to link the San Francisco Bay at Alameda, California with the nation's existing Eastern Railroad network at Council Bluffs, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, thereby creating the world's first transcontinental railroad when it opened in 1869. Its construction was made possible by the U.S. government under Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862, 1864 and 1867. North America. United States. A transcontinental railroad in the United States is any continuous rail line connecting a location on the U.S. Pacific coast with one or more of the railroads of the nation's eastern trunk line rail systems operating between the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and the U.S. Atlantic coast. The first concrete plan for a transcontinental railroad in the United States was presented to Congress by Asher Whitney in 1845. The world's first transcontinental railroad was built between 1863 and 1869 to join the eastern and western halves of the United States. Begun just before the American Civil War, its construction was considered to be one of the greatest American technological feats of the 19th century. Known as the Pacific Railroad when it opened, this served as a vital link for trade, commerce, and travel and opened up vast regions of the North American heartland for settlement. Shipping and commerce could thrive away from navigable watercourses for the first time since the beginning of the nation. Much of this line is currently used by Amtrak's California Zephyr, although some parts were rerouted or abandoned. The Transcontinental Railroad provided fast, safe, and cheap travel. The fare for a one-week trip from Omaha to San Francisco on an emigrant sleeping car was about $65 for an adult. It replaced most of the far slower and more hazardous stagecoach lines and wagon trains. The number of emigrants taking the Oregon and California Trail declined dramatically. The sale of the railroad land grant lands and the transport provided for timber and crops led to the rapid settling of the Great American Desert. The Union Pacific recruited laborers from Army veterans and Irish immigrants, while most of the engineers were ex-Army men who had learned their trade keeping the trains running during the American Civil War. The Central Pacific Railroad faced a labor shortage in the more sparsely settled West. It recruited Cantonese laborers in China, who did prodigious work building the line over and through the Sierra Nevada mountains and then across Nevada to the meeting in northern Utah. One motive for the Gadsden purchase of land from Mexico in 1853 was to obtain suitable terrain for a southern transcontinental railroad, as the southern portion of the Mexican cession was too mountainous. The Southern Pacific Railroad was completed in 1881. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 authorized land grants for new lines that would aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. The rails of the First Transcontinental Railroad were joined on May 10, 1869, with the ceremonial driving of the last spike at Promontory Summit, Utah, after track was laid over a 2,826-kilometer gap between Sacramento and Omaha, Nebraska, Council Bluffs, Iowa in 6 years by the Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific Railroad. Although through train service was in operation as of that date, the road was not deemed to have been officially completed until November 6, 1869. The Southern Pacific Railroad completed the Second Transcontinental Railroad with milestones and ceremonies in 1881, 1882, and 1883. December 15, 1881, the SP meets the Texas and Pacific Railway at Sierra Blanca, Texas, connecting eastern Texas to Los Angeles. 1881 or 1882, the SP meets the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway at Deming, New Mexico, connecting Atchison, Kansas to Los Angeles. January 12, 1883, the SP completes its own southern section, meeting the subsidiary Galveston, Harrisburg and San Antonio Railway at the Pecos River in Texas, and linking New Orleans to Los Angeles. The Northern Pacific Railway completed the third independent transcontinental railroad on August 22, 1883, linking Chicago with Seattle. The completion ceremony was held on September 8, 1883, with former U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant contributing to driving the final spike. The California Southern Railroad was completed from National City on San Diego Bay via Temecula Canyon to Colton and San Bernardino in September 1883, and extended through the Cajon Pass to Barstow, a junction of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, in November 1885. In September 1885, the line of the Southern Pacific from Colton to Los Angeles, a distance of 58 miles, had been leased by the California Central with equal rights and privileges, thus allowing the Santa Fe's transcontinental route to be completed by the connection with the California Southern and AMP-PRR. The SP grade was used until the completion of the California Central's own line between San Bernardino and Los Angeles in June 1887, a distance of 62.84 miles, which was part of the old Los Angeles and San Gabriel Valley Railroad, which had been acquired by purchase. In August 1888, the California Central completed its coast division south from Los Angeles to a junction with the California Southern Railroad near Oceanside, a distance of 80.90 miles, and these two divisions comprised the main line of the California Central, forming, in connection with the California Southern, a direct line between Southern California and the east by way of the Atlantic and Pacific, and Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroads. The Great Northern Railway was built, without federal aid, by James J. Hill in 1893. It stretched from St. Paul to Seattle. In 1909, the Chicago, Milwaukee and AMP-St. Paul completed a privately built Pacific extension to Seattle. On completion, the line was renamed the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific. Although the Pacific extension was privately funded, predecessor roads did benefit from the Federal Land Grant Act, so it cannot be said to have been built without federal aid. John D. Spreckels completed his privately funded San Diego and Arizona Railway in 1919, thereby creating a direct link between San Diego, California and the eastern United States. The railroad stretched 238 kilometers from San Diego to Calexico, California. In 1993, Amtrak's Sunset Limited daily railroad train was extended eastward to the Atlantic Ocean, making it the first transcontinental passenger train route in the United States to be operated by a single company. Hurricane Katrina cut this rail route in Louisiana in 2005. The train now runs from Los Angeles to New Orleans. George J. Gould attempted to assemble a truly transcontinental system in the 1900s. The line from San Francisco, California, to Toledo, Ohio, was completed in 1909, consisting of the Western Pacific Railway, Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, Missouri Pacific Railroad, and the Wabash Railroad. Beyond Toledo, the planned route would have used the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad, Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal Railway, Little Canal Railroad, West Virginia Central and Pittsburgh Railway, Western Maryland Railroad, and Philadelphia and Western Railway. But the Panic of 1907 strangled the plans before the Little Canal section in West Virginia could be finished. The Alphabet route was completed in 1931, providing the portion of this line east of the Mississippi River. With the merging of the railroads, only the Union Pacific Railroad and a BNSF railway remained to carry the entire route. Canada. The completion of Canada's first transcontinental railroad on November 7, 1885 is an important milestone in Canadian history. Between 1881 and 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway completed a line that spanned from the port of Montreal to the Pacific coast, fulfilling a condition of British Columbia's 1871 entry into the Canadian Confederation. The city of Vancouver, incorporated in 1886, was designated the western terminus of the line. The CPR became the first transcontinental railway company in North America in 1889 after its International Railway of Maine opened, connecting CPR to the Atlantic coast. The construction of a transcontinental railroad strengthened the connection of British Columbia and the Northwest Territories to the Dominion of Canada they had recently joined, and acted as a bulwark against potential incursions by the United States. Subsequently, two other transcontinental lines were built in Canada. The Canadian Northern Railway opened another line to the Pacific in 1912, and the combined Grand Trunk Pacific Railway National Transcontinental Railway system opened in 1917 following the completion of the Quebec Bridge, although its line to the Pacific opened in 1914. The CNOR, GTPR, and NTR were nationalized to form the Canadian National Railway, which currently is now Canada's largest transcontinental railway, with lines running all the way from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast. Central America. Panama. The first railroad to directly connect two oceans was the Panama Railroad. Opened in 1855, this 77-kilometer line was designated instead as an interoceanic railroad crossing Central America at its narrowest point, the Isthmus of Panama, when that area was still part of Colombia. By spanning the isthmus, the line thus became the first railroad to completely cross any part of the Americas and physically connect ports on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Given the tropical rainforest environment, the terrain, and diseases such as malaria and cholera, its completion was a considerable engineering challenge. The construction took 5 years after ground was first broken for the line in May 18 1950, cost $8 million, and required more than 7,000 workers drawn from every quarter of the globe. This railway was built to provide a shorter and more secure path between the United States' east and west coasts. This need was mainly triggered by the California gold rush. Over the years, the railway played a key role in the construction and the subsequent operation of the Panama Canal, due to its proximity to the canal. Currently, the railway operates under the private administration of the Panama Canal Railroad Company, and its upgraded capacity complements the cargo traffic through the Panama Canal. Guatemala. A second Central American interoceanic railroad began operation in 1908 as a connection between Puerto San Jose and Puerto Barrios in Guatemala, but ceased passenger service to Puerto San Jose in 1989. Costa Rica. A third Central American interoceanic railroad began operation in 1910 as a connection between Punta Arenas and Limon in 1067 mm gauge. Mexico. Panama. FERISDSA, a proposed standard gauge north-south line. South America. There is activity to revive the connection between Valparaiso and Santiago in Chile and Mendoza, Argentina, through the Transandino project. Mendoza has an active connection to Buenos Aires. The old Transandino began in 1910 and ceased passenger service in 1978 and freight 4 years later. Technically, a complete transcontinental link exists from Arica, Chile, to La Paz, Bolivia, to Buenos Aires, but this Transandean crossing is for freight only. Another longer transcontinental freight-only railroad linking Lima, Peru, to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil is under development. Eurasia. The first transcontinental railroad in Europe that connected the North Sea of the English Channel with the Mediterranean Sea was a series of lines that included the Paris-Marseille Railway, in service 1856. The second connection between the seas of Northern Europe and the Mediterranean Sea was a series of lines finalized in 1857 with the Austrian Southern Railway, Vienna-Trieste. There were before that railroad connections Hamburg-Berlin-Wrocław-Vienna. The Baltic Sea was also connected through the Lübeck-Lüneburg Railway. The first Eurasian transcontinental railroad was the Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in 1905, which connects Moscow with Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. There are two connections from this line to China. It is the world's longest rail line at 9,289 kilometers long. This line connects the European railroad system with China, Mongolia and Korea, since the former Soviet countries and Mongolia use a broader gauge. A break of gauges necessarily either at the eastern frontiers of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania at the Chinese border. In spite of this, there are through services of passenger trains between Moscow and Beijing through coaches from Berlin to Novosibirsk. Almost every major town along the Trans-Siberian Railway has its own return service to Moscow. A second rail line connects Istanbul in Turkey with China via Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. This route imposes a break of gauge at the Iranian border with Turkmenistan and at the Chinese border. En route there is a train ferry in eastern Turkey across Lake Van. The European and Asian parts of Istanbul are linked by a train ferry, and an undersea tunnel is under construction. There is no through service of passenger trains on the entire line. A uniform gauge connection was proposed in 2006, commencing with new construction in Kazakhstan. A decision to make the internal railways of Afghanistan 1,435 mm gauge potentially opens up a new standard gauge route to China, since China abuts this country. Asia. The Trans-Asian Railway is a project to link Singapore to Istanbul and is to a large degree complete, with missing pieces primarily in Myanmar. The project has also linking corridors to China, the Central Asian states, and Russia. This transcontinental line unfortunately uses a number of different gauges: 1,435 mm, 1,676 mm, 1,520 mm, and 1,000 mm. Though this problem may be lessened with the use of variable gauge axle systems such as the SUW-2000. The Trans-Kazakhstan Trunk Railways project by Kazakhstan Temir Joly will connect China and Europe with standard gauge 1,435 mm. Construction is set to start in 2006. Initially the line will go to western Kazakhstan, south through Turkmenistan to Iran, then to Turkey and Europe. A shorter to be constructed 1,435 mm link from Kazakhstan is considered going through Russia and either Belarus or Ukraine. The Baghdad Railway connects Istanbul with Baghdad and finally Basra, a seaport at the Persian Gulf. When its construction started in the 1880s, it was in those times a transcontinental railroad. Australia. East-west. The first Trans-Australian Railway was completed in 1917, between Port Augusta and Kalgoorlie, and crosses the Nullarbor Plain. This line completed the link between the mainland state capitals of Brisbane, then Sydney via Melbourne, and Adelaide to the western state capital of Perth. This route suffered from a number of breaks of gauge, using 1,435 mm twice, 1,600 mm once, and 1,067 mm thrice, with 5 breaks of gauge in all. The Trans-Australian Railway was the first route operated by the federal government. In the 1940s, 1970s, and 2000s, steps were taken to rationalize the gauge chaos and connect the mainland capital cities mentioned above with standard gauge 1,435 mm. Since 1970, when the direct standard gauge line across the country was completed, the passenger train on the Sydney to Perth line has been called the Indian Pacific. The proposed iron boomerang would connect iron in the Pilbara with coal in Queensland, so achieving loaded operations in both directions. North-south. A 1,320-kilometre land grant railway from Charleville to Point Parker on the Gulf of Carpentaria, with branches, was proposed in the 1880s. The first north-south Trans-Australia Railway opened in January 2004 and links Darwin to Adelaide with a Garn passenger train. The Adelaide-Darwin Railway is standard a 1,435 mm gauge, though the original line to Alice Springs was 1,067 mm gauge. In 2006, proposals for new lines in Queensland that would carry both interstate coal traffic and interstate freight traffic would see standard gauge penetrate the state in considerable stretches for the first time. The standard gauge inland railway would ultimately extend from Melbourne to Cairns. Starting in 1867, Queensland built several railways going inland from several ports in a westerly direction. For the 1920s, steps were taken to connect these lines by the north-south North Coast Line from Brisbane to Cairns. Africa. East-west. There are several ways to cross Africa transcontinentally by connecting west-east railroads. One is the Benguela Railway that was completed in 1929. It starts in Lobito, Angola and connects through Katanga to the Zambia railway system. From Zambia, several ports are accessible on the Indian Ocean: Dar es Salaam in Tanzania through the Tazara, and through Zimbabwe, Beira and Maputo in Mozambique. The Angolan Civil War has made the Benguela line largely inoperative, but efforts are being taken to restore it. Another west-east corridor leads from the Atlantic harbors in Namibia, either Walvis Bay or Lutritz, to the South African rail system that, in turn, links to ports on the Indian Ocean. A 1,015 km gap in the east-west line between Kinshasa and Illibo, filled by riverboats, could be plugged with a new railway. There are two proposals for a line from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Guinea, including Trans-Africa Rail. In 2010, a proposal surfaced to link Dakar to Port Sudan. 13 countries are on the main route, while another 6 would be served by branches. North-South. A north-south transcontinental railroad had been proposed by Cecil Rhodes, the Cape Cairo Railway. This system was seen as the backbone for the African possessions of the British Empire, and was not completed. During its development, a competing French colonial project for a competing line from Algiers to Dakar to Abidjan was abandoned after the Fashoda incident. This line would have had 4-gauge islands in 3 gauges. An extension of Namibian railways is being built in 2006 with a possible connection to Angolan railways. Libya has proposed a trans-Saharan railway connecting possibly to Nigeria, which would connect with the proposed Africa Rail network. African Union of Railways. The African Union of Railways has plans to connect the various railways of Africa, including the Dakar Port Sudan Railway.